Have you ever stood on a mountaintop during a thunderstorm? The sky darkens, the air crackles with electricity, and suddenly, boom, thunder shakes the very ground beneath your feet. In those moments, even the most skeptical person feels small in the face of such raw power. What if I told you that ancient people didn't just fear these storms, but saw them as divine messages? That's exactly what we're exploring today. Around 3,000 years ago, in the hills of ancient Israel, a poet king named David stood in awe of a magnificent thunderstorm sweeping across the Mediterranean coast. Instead of running for shelter, he reached for his harp and composed one of the most powerful nature poems ever written. This composition would later become Psalm 29 in the Hebrew Bible, a piece that uses the imagery of a storm to reveal the voice and power of God in ways that still resonate with us today. What makes this psalm so special? Unlike other religious texts that simply praise a deity, Psalm 29 invites us to experience the divine through the sensory experience of nature itself. It transforms what could be terrifying, lightning, thunder, powerful winds, into a cosmic symphony conducted by the Creator. And here's the fascinating part. Archaeological evidence suggests that David was deliberately countering the storm god Baal worship of neighboring Canaanites by showing that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the true master of the elements. The date was approximately 1000 BCE. The kingdom of Israel was establishing itself among nations that worshipped various nature deities. In this context, David's psalm wasn't just poetry, it was a theological declaration. Now, let's journey through this remarkable text together and discover why it continues to captivate readers millennia later. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. The psalm begins with a summons to the heavenly beings, or in Hebrew, B'nai Elohim. Scholars debate whether this refers to angels, lesser deities in the ancient Near Eastern pantheon, or possibly powerful earthly rulers. What's significant is that David calls these mighty beings to acknowledge someone even greater than themselves. In the ancient world of 1000 BCE, recognition from powerful entities legitimized one's authority. By calling on these heavenly beings to praise God, David establishes a cosmic hierarchy with Yahweh at the pinnacle. This would have been revolutionary in a polytheistic environment where gods competed for power and prestige. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. The Hebrew word for glory here is kavod, which literally means weight or heaviness. In ancient Near Eastern culture, a person's glory was related to their importance or influence, how much weight they carried in society. David is saying that God's name carries the ultimate weight of authority. The splendor of holiness refers to ritual purity and set-apartness. In ancient Israel, approaching sacred spaces required careful preparation. The phrase reminds listeners that encountering God isn't casual. It demands reverence and recognition of his transcendence. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, the Lord, over many waters. Now the storm imagery begins. Water in ancient Hebrew thought represented chaos and the unknown. The Mediterranean Sea, with its unpredictable storms, embodied danger to land-dwelling Israelites. When David says God's voice is over the waters, he's claiming that Yahweh maintains control over chaos itself. The phrase many waters appears in ancient Ugaritic texts about Baal, the Canaanite storm god. Historical records from archaeological excavations at Ras Shamra, ancient Ugarit, in 1929 revealed fascinating parallels between Canaanite poetry about Baal and the imagery in Psalm 29. David appears to be deliberately using familiar cultural imagery, but redirecting it toward Yahweh, effectively saying, "The power you attribute to Baal actually belongs to our God." The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The Hebrew word for voice used repeatedly in this psalm is kal, which can mean voice, sound, or thunder. It appears 7 times throughout the psalm, a significant number in Hebrew thought representing completeness or perfection. Each mention of God's voice demonstrates a different aspect of divine power. The term translated as majesty is hadar in Hebrew, which conveys both beauty and awesomeness. It suggests that God's power isn't merely brute force. It contains artistic splendor. Think of how lightning illuminates the landscape in breathtaking ways, even as it demonstrates raw energy. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. Now we move from sea to land. Cedars of Lebanon were the most impressive trees in the ancient Near East, growing up to 150 feet tall, with trunks 8 feet in diameter. They represented stability, longevity, and strength. King Solomon imported these cedars for building Jerusalem's temple in the 10th century BCE, as recorded in 1 Kings 5. The cedar forests of Lebanon stood about 200 miles north of Jerusalem. When massive thunderstorms rolled in from the Mediterranean, they would first hit these mountains. The image of lightning splitting these mighty trees would have been familiar to David's audience. Historical context is important here. The Canaanites believed their god Baal resided in the mountains of Lebanon. By describing Yahweh breaking the cedars there, David is essentially claiming that the God of Israel demonstrates power in the very realm supposedly controlled by a rival deity. He makes Lebanon to skip like a calf, and Sirion like a young wild ox. Lebanon refers to the mountain range, not just the cedars. Sirion was the Sidonian name for Mount Hermon, standing at over 9,000 feet on the border of modern Lebanon and Syria. These massive geographical features were considered permanent and immovable. When David describes them skipping like young animals, he's using poetic hyperbole to describe how even Earth's most solid features tremble during powerful earthquakes that sometimes accompanied major thunderstorms. Geological records confirm that this region sits on a seismic fault line, making such experiences realistic for ancient Israelites. The comparison to a calf and wild ox isn't random. Bulls were symbols of Baal in Canaanite religion, often depicted in their iconography. Once again, David appears to be subverting Canaanite religious imagery, suggesting that what they worship as divine is merely part of Yahweh's creation. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. Lightning, with its ability to ignite fires, represented both destruction and purification in ancient thought. Forest fires sparked by lightning were common in the Mediterranean climate, where dry summers created perfect conditions for rapid spreading of flames. The Hebrew phrase used here literally translates as "hews out flames of fire," using the same verb as stone cutting. This suggests God shapes and directs the lightning with precision rather than unleashing chaotic destruction. It portrays divine power as controlled and purposeful. This imagery would have resonated with Israelites who remembered the pillar of fire that guided them during the Exodus approximately 400 years earlier, around 1446 BCE, according to traditional dating. That manifestation of divine presence used fire as a symbol of guidance rather than destruction. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The storm has now moved inland to the desert. The wilderness of Kadesh likely refers to Kadesh Barnea, an oasis in the Negev desert where the Israelites camped during their wilderness wanderings around 1400 BCE. It represents barren, uninhabited spaces. Desert thunderstorms create distinctive echoing effects as sound bounces between rock formations. The Hebrew word for shake here is yakal, which can also mean to bring forth in pain, like childbirth. This suggests that God's power doesn't just destroy, it creates new possibilities even in desolate places. The mention of Kadesh specifically evokes Israel's national memory. At Kadesh, the people had refused to enter the promised land out of fear, resulting in 40 years of desert wandering. By including this location, David subtly reminds his audience of the consequences of failing to trust God's power. The voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth and strips the forests bare, and in his temple all cry, "Glory." This verse presents one of the most interesting natural observations in the psalm. Modern wildlife studies confirm that sudden loud noises can indeed induce labor in some mammals, including deer. The sudden barometric pressure changes during storms can also trigger birth in animals ready to deliver. The image of forests being stripped bare likely refers to both lightning-struck trees and the way heavy winds remove leaves and branches. The Hebrew word used here, yekasoph, carries connotations of exposure and revelation, suggesting that God's power reveals what was previously hidden. The temple reference creates a transition from nature to human worship. In ancient Israel, the temple was the meeting place between heaven and earth, where divine presence was most concentrated. When nature displays God's power, the proper human response is acknowledgement and praise. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. The Hebrew word for flood here is mabul, the same term used for Noah's flood in Genesis. This connects the psalm to primordial history, suggesting God's sovereignty extends even over catastrophic judgment. Archaeological evidence from throughout Mesopotamia confirms widespread flood stories across ancient Near Eastern cultures around 3000 BCE. The image of God sitting while creation churns below reinforces divine transcendence. Unlike humans who must flee from floods, God remains calmly in control of even the most chaotic natural forces. The eternal kingship mentioned forms a stark contrast with the temporary nature of storms. While the tempest eventually passes, God's rule continues uninterrupted. This would have provided comfort to David's original audience living in turbulent political times as surrounding empires like Egypt and Assyria rose and fell. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. After all the thunderous power displayed throughout the psalm, the conclusion might seem surprising. The ultimate purpose of God's strength isn't intimidation, but protection and peace for his people. The Hebrew word for peace here, shalom, encompasses not just absence of conflict, but wholeness, well-being, and flourishing. This final verse reveals the pastoral heart behind David's theology. While neighboring cultures feared their storm gods and offered sacrifices to appease their unpredictable wrath, David presents Yahweh's power as ultimately beneficial to those in covenant relationship with him. Psalm 29 reveals something profound about how ancient Israelites understood their relationship with the divine. While their neighbors cowered in fear during thunderstorms, offering sacrifices to appease angry gods, the Israelites could see the same natural phenomena as displays of their God's majestic power that ultimately worked for their benefit. The genius of this psalm lies in how it transforms potential terror into worship. Instead of running from the storm, David invites us to see in it the voice of God, powerful yet purposeful, mighty yet majestic. What terrifies becomes what inspires. Archaeological discoveries shed fascinating light on this text. Excavations at Tel Dan in northern Israel uncovered evidence of storm god worship that was prevalent in the region during David's time, around 1000 BCE. The deliberate parallels between Psalm 29 and Canaanite hymns to Baal suggest that David was engaged in a form of theological reframing, helping Israel resist cultural assimilation by adapting familiar imagery to express their distinctive monotheistic faith. Consider how this psalm would have functioned in ancient Israel's worship. Imagine yourself in the Jerusalem temple courtyard as storm clouds gather on the horizon. As thunder begins to rumble, the choir begins chanting these words. With each lightning flash and thunderclap, the worshippers don't cower in fear, but respond with glory. The storm becomes not a threat, but a theophany, a visible manifestation of divine presence. This psalm also carries ecological wisdom that resonates in our time. It portrays nature not as a resource to be exploited, but as a theater displaying divine glory. The proper human response isn't domination, but reverence. In a world facing climate crises, this ancient text reminds us that we stand alongside creation as fellow witnesses to transcendent power. Throughout history, communities facing natural disasters have turned to Psalm 29. Jewish communities recited it during the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE, when they were forcibly relocated from their homeland. Early Christians sang it during persecutions under the Roman Empire around 64 CE. Medieval European villages chanted it during the devastating storms that sometimes destroyed crops and livelihoods. The psalm's enduring resonance lies in how it meets our human need to find meaning in potentially frightening experiences. By framing natural power as divine communication rather than random destruction, it offers a path through fear toward reverence. Let's consider how this ancient wisdom might speak to us today. When we experience overwhelming forces, whether literal storms or metaphorical ones in our lives, where do we locate meaning? Do we see only chaos, or can we discern purpose? Neurological research from studies conducted at the University of Pennsylvania in 2019 suggests that finding transcendent meaning in challenging experiences activates brain regions associated with resilience and emotional regulation. Perhaps the ancient poet was tapping into profound psychological wisdom when he reframed fearsome natural phenomena as expressions of divine communication. For those who embrace a theistic worldview, Psalm 29 invites us to listen for God's voice in unexpected places. For those with different perspectives, it still offers wisdom about humanity's need to integrate powerful experiences into meaningful narratives. Either way, it challenges us to move beyond simple fear toward a more nuanced engagement with the awesome forces that shape our world. The psalm reminds us that true strength isn't about dominating others, but providing peace and security. In a world where power is often equated with aggression, this ancient text offers a corrective vision. The most profound demonstration of strength is not destruction, but creation and preservation of life. As we conclude our exploration of this remarkable ancient poem, I invite you to listen differently the next time you experience a thunderstorm. Whether you understand it as divine communication or natural phenomenon, consider how the display of raw power connects you to generations of humans who have stood in awe before forces greater than themselves. The voice that shakes cedars and deserts isn't ultimately a voice of terror, but one that births new possibilities and strips away pretense. It's a voice that reminds us of our smallness, while simultaneously affirming our significance within a greater story. In a time when we're often disconnected from natural rhythms and insulated from elemental forces, perhaps we need this ancient poem more than ever. It invites us back into a posture of wonder, where appropriate humility before power becomes not diminishment, but enlargement of our humanity. The voice of the Lord continues to speak, through nature, through history, through sacred texts, and through the quiet promptings of conscience. The question isn't whether the voice is speaking, but whether we have ears to hear. May we hear that voice. May we find strength in it. And ultimately, may we discover in it not just power, but peace. Before you go, I want to personally invite you to be part of our growing community here at Prayer Universe. If this video touched your heart or brought you peace, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a prayer or message that can uplift your spirit. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, share just one word or phrase of motivation that this video inspired in you, whether it's hope, gratitude, peace, or something else. Your words matter deeply to us because they help guide the content we create for this channel. Together, let's build a space filled with faith, encouragement, and connection. Thank you for being here, And remember, every prayer counts. See you in the next one.